Welcome to the Old Idaho Penitentiary. My name is Monica Lange, and I'm an Interpretive Specialist, as JC noted, for the Idaho State Historical Society here. In January of this year, I sat down with Anthony Perry, our site historian, and JC Brain, our visitor services coordinator, and put together a research project that would be really worthwhile that I could tackle. There were really just a handful of Indigenous peoples who were incarcerated here that we really had any knowledge of, and only 3 of these were from the Territorial Prison time period. We decided that I would undertake discovering as many more people of tribal ancestry imprisoned here during this time period as I could, along with their histories, while providing historical context as well. I'm honored to be sharing the fruits of this research with you in tonight's captivating conversation. These beautiful seals represent the 5 tribal nations whose lands are within the boundaries of present-day Idaho. These include the Coeur d'Alene, Kootenai, Nez Perce, Shoshone-Bannock, and Shoshone-Paiute tribes. The 5 tribes in today's Idaho have nearly 10,000 members residing here and possess nearly 1 million acres of land. Their total land area would be ranked at 20th in the state in terms of size when compared to the state's other 44 counties. The 5 tribes are a top 10 employer within this state, producing $1.1 billion in annual sales and donating over $2 million annually to Idaho charities and schools. The ancestors of the 5 tribes in what is now Idaho adapted to, thrived in these lands of the Plateau and Great Basin areas over thousands of years. As this area came to be colonized, tribal people were coerced to live on reservations, which were established either by treaty, executive order, or by being deeded by the president. Over the years, these reservations have distinguished themselves as springs of land conservation, cultural customs, and economic value to the benefit of Idaho. I want to provide a brief overview of the history of federal policies impacting tribal peoples. One thing you will notice is that the 3 momentous periods of impact after contact occurred during the time of the territorial prison. So this means that this was a time of rapid and life-altering change for tribal peoples, as the colonial, treaty, allocation, and assimilation periods really altered their lifeways, family structures, and cultures. Initially, tribal peoples held and controlled their resources by right. During the colonial period of 1492 through the 1800s, non-tribal peoples developed thinking by which they justified their taking over of Aboriginal lands. The doctrine of discovery asserted that non-European people voided the right to their territories, with the right of attaining legal title to those then being granted simultaneously to European nations. Manifest Destiny expanded this right to the U.S. government, who was solely authorized to purchase land from tribal governments. Although Indigenous nations fought in the American Revolution, they were banished from the east to the lands west of the Mississippi River by the Indian Removal Act of 1830. Both the 1862 Homestead Act and Pacific Railroad Act endangered treaty obligations, opening Western Indigenous lands to non-Indigenous homesteading. Some Shoshone-Bannock fought intrusion in the 1860 waylay of the Utter Wagon Train Party, killing or capturing 29 immigrants. Discovery of gold in the Boise Basin in 1862 pushed local tribes off their ancestral lands, resulting in the 1864 Treaty of Fort Boise. In 1871, the federal government ceased making treaties, but persisted in negotiating land cessions with the tribes. After the initial wave of settlers relocated across the West, the federal government wanted to clear indigenous land for subsequent continuous streams of settlers. They achieved this through a program of expropriation and assimilation, delivering a major blow to the development of reservation economies, suffering from the significant loss of lands and vital resources. The Dawes, or Allotment Act of 1887, allotted each family a plot of land to farm Western style, breaking up communal tribal lands. Oftentimes, these families who were not yet part of the cash economy could not even pay the property taxes necessary to keep this land, and it would be forfeited as a result. Unallotted and forfeited land was then sold off to non-tribal settlers, resulting in a truly checkerboard pattern of ownership and jurisdiction. This jurisdictional nightmare is something that the current Violence Against Women Act pending is seeking to remedy. So a major platform of this assimilation policy was the abrupt transfer of Indigenous children from their family home to religious or government-run boarding schools. These children would have their long hair cut short, as you can see in the photo. This was a culturally demoralizing experience for them, as long hair is spiritually significant in tribal cultures. They were forbidden from speaking their language and from following their traditional religion or culture. The idea was that they would be assimilated into the prevailing U.S. culture. Sickness and abuse were hallmarks of such schools. The above photo is of Indigenous children at the Fort Hall boarding school, where 68 died from scarlet fever in 1890. The U.S. Army then forcibly led them to school in 1897. The territory of Idaho was organized by an act of Congress in 1863 and signed into law by President Abraham Lincoln. The original territory covered nearly all of the present-day states of Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming, so it was huge. County jails in Lewiston and Idaho City were deemed temporary territorial prisons in 1864, with county sheriffs serving as the keepers of these prisons. Conditions were very poor: unsanitary, dark, cold, and unventilated. Understaffing and chaos resulted in high escape rates. In 1866, all prisoners were transferred from the Boise County Jail, where they formed a chain gang. 91 men and women were imprisoned in these jails between 1864 and 1872, including the first two Indigenous peoples, Wishtakustman and Nine Pipes, from Nez Perce County. People of the Nez Perce tribe refer to themselves as the Nimipu, meaning the real people. The name Nez Perce was a misnomer, as piercing the nose was not a customary practice of this tribe. They provisioned Lewis and Clark in the expedition in 1805, who lived thanks to the camas bulbs provided them by tribal peoples, but suffered serious indigestion, as camas must first be properly roasted to avoid this. This tribe trekked seasonally for peak hunting, fishing, and gathering. They are renowned for their selective breeding of the Appaloosa, and horses became central to hunting buffalo and as warriors. The Nez Perce made skillfully woven hemp and corn husk bags. Their traditional land spanned 5 states. Wishtakustman is indicted and pleads guilty to 1 count of grand larceny. When I started working at the pen, I had no idea what that was. I had to look it up. So it was the non-violent theft of another's property, valued at $50 or more at this time. Based on this sentencing and the territorial law's distinction between grand and petite larceny, it would appear that the value of goods that he is convicted of stealing was right around $50 or around $900 in today's money. He's sentenced to serve 6 months in the penitentiary. Nine Pipes is convicted on 2 counts of grand larceny and is sentenced to a total term of 18 months in the temporary territorial prison. Although the newspaper articles do not specify what these two stole, just based on the values and also the fact that horses were a frequent target of theft at this time, it's reasonable to suppose that might have been it. Horses did not have alarms like our cars nowadays, so they were pretty easy to take. Remember Nine Pipes, we will come back to him. So due to overcrowding, in 1867, Congress authorizes funds for constructing a new territorial prison, and that is going to be literally this building right outside this window here on my right. It will be strategically located right at the base of the Boise foothills due to a profusion of handy-dandy sandstone, which prisoners would later quarry through back-breaking labor. The cornerstone, you can also see was removed out there, was laid on Independence Day in 1870. We joke here at the Penn that it was sort of ironic to found a prison on a day celebrating freedom, but this was a really big deal for the area. The first 11 men entered the prison, which had 3 tiers and 42 cells, in March of 1872, after the federal and territory governments finally hashed out a budget for accommodating prisoners. So this evening, we will cover 4 wars fought during the time of the territorial prison. That's a lot in that short of a time frame. The first of these is the Nez Perce War. This was fought in resistance to the forced removal of the tribe in violation of the Treaty of Walla Walla. It spanned 1,200 miles and was marked by very fierce battles. It ended when Colonel Miles caught up with Chief Joseph and the Nez Perce camp, only 40 miles from the Canadian border in Montana Territory. It was here that Joseph delivered a speech conveying dignity and bravery in the face of severe losses. His moving "I Will Fight No More Forever" speech is featured in the Anne Frank Human Rights Memorial here in Boise. I cry every time I read that speech. It's so moving. The Bannock people also moved according to the seasonal rounds, and they would meet up with members of the Shoshone and Northern Paiute tribes for the annual camas harvest in late spring near present-day Fairfield, a social pinnacle of their year. Gathering the bulb en masse, as you can see in the bottom picture there, they would roast them in earthen ovens and make cakes for the winter. Children would take sticks and make lollipops from the caramelized sugars of the roasted bulbs. An influx of settlers and herders ravaged the staple, which comprised 40 to 80% of the diet of local tribes. Trust for the federal government was eroding due to the massacre of 400 Shoshone people at Bear River in 1863 by volunteer fighters led by Colonel Patrick O'Connor. Broken treaties resulting in lack of payment, ever-shrinking reservations, and the loss of vital resources. The massacre was filled with harrowing experiences, such as those of mothers hidden near the river, who were forced to choose between drowning crying infants or all being killed by soldiers sure to find them. Throughout the 1870s, deprivations were acute at the Fort Hall Indian Reservation, where tribal peoples were promised food and provisions upon arrival, but were getting nourishment only 3 days a week. In desperation, their agent allowed them to go to Camas Prairie to gather their traditional staple. Due to a treaty error made by a recording clerk of Kansa Prairie, ranchers and pig herders took over, devouring the plant with the root so it wouldn't regrow. When the Nez Perce War broke out in 1877, the Shoshone Bannock were brought in and confined to Fort Hall, not able to hunt buffalo, worsening their condition due to starvation rations. This context sets the stage for the introduction of the next 2 tribal peoples to be incarcerated at the territorial prison, Nohowa and Tambiago. In August of 1877, a 22-year-old Bannock man named Nohowa overtakes 2 freighters at Ross Fork, presumably to get food to feed his people, injuring 3 teamsters in the process. An alternate cause for these actions is given by Bannock peoples to Sarah Winnemucca in her book, Life Among the Paiutes, being that this crime was avenging the sexual assault of a sister who was attacked by Euro-Americans while gathering camas bulbs in a field. After Nohuas surrenders, his brother or close friend, Tombiago, acts out in resentment. He encounters and shoots Alex Roden, a non-native supplier of beef to the reservation, who collapses and dies. Tombiago takes flight. Nohua is indicted on 3 counts of assault with intent to kill. He nearly escapes Malad City, but officers and citizens recapture him after a struggle. He is convicted and sentenced to a term of 12 years in the penitentiary. Tombiago is captured, along with his father and brothers, in January of the following year. They're returned to Fort Hall and held in a stockade. When his father resists the cutting of their hair and wearing of military uniforms, he and Tombiago's brothers are banished to Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. Tombiago is transferred to Malad to stand trial in May. Tombiago's trial is somewhat of a formality. Although he pleads not guilty, he does not take part in his defense and clearly distrusts the proceedings. His counsel, B.F. White, fails to even argue his case. The jury pronounces him guilty on May 29th, and Judge Prickett sentences him to death. His execution is set to be carried out on June 28th. Subsequent to Tombiago's arrest, U.S. troops arrive at Fort Hall and seize men, guns, and horses, fueling growing resentment. When Chief Buffalo Horn and others head to Camas Prairie hungry in May of 1878 and find cattle and horses destroying their vital staple, he orders the ranchers to withdraw. In the interim, 2 desperate young warriors attack 3 of the ranchers, seriously wounding 2. Knowing the tribe will be held liable for the actions of these few, Buffalo Horn decides they would rather die fighting than of starvation. Troops and volunteers march out from Fort Boise, and the Bannock War has begun. General Crook, when tasked with determining what led to the outbreak of these hostilities, said that the federal government's treatment of tribal peoples was an outrage. Chiefs Buffalo Horn and Egan die, leading the fighting across Idaho and into Oregon. Hostilities lasted from May through August of 1878, culminating in the loss of life for 78 people, 9 soldiers, and 31 citizens. Bannock women and children suffered hardships and incurred the same risks as the men, and tribal peoples were not permitted to aid their elderly when marched back to reservations as prisoners of war, resulting in additional suffering and deaths. Tombiago is held in a cell next to Nohua at the Territorial Prison. Speaking with the priest, he reveals that he hopes his chief will come for him. He states that the cause of the war was Camas Prairie, that it belonged to his people and they needed it. He mentions how their arrest and that of 4 others who were presumed dead led to the outbreak of the hostilities as well. When told that he could have these grievances recorded and sent to Washington, he replied that it wouldn't make any difference, that those in Washington wouldn't do anything on behalf of his people. His sentiments reflect the despondency felt by tribal peoples towards the U.S. government, grounded in their harsh reality. In addition, he's questioned by Army officials regarding Bannock war planning. Temporary wooden gallows, such as the one shown above, are built for his execution. Tombiago and Nohua, having made it this far together, now request to die together. This request is denied. Nohua's subsequent suicide attempt the day before Tombiago's execution is thwarted. As this is the height of Bannock War, around 250 people from the town of Boise City come out and line the hills to watch his execution by hanging in the pouring rain. Although unsure about the covering placed over his head, Tombiago is composed throughout the procedure. At 1 p.m., the executioner proceeds, the drop falls, and Tombiago is pronounced dead by Dr. Treadwell at the end of 7.5 minutes. His execution is covered in countless newspapers across America. Nohua is noted for good behavior during the 6 years he was held at the Territorial Prison. In 1883 entry states that he died on July 8th at 11 p.m. He was just 31 years old when he died from consumption, according to newspaper reports. Today, this infectious lung disease is commonly known as tuberculosis. This epidemic spread across Europe and North America in the late 1800s and was called the robber of youth for its higher death rate among young people. Eagle Shakantaya is the 30-year-old man from the Nez Perce tribe. He's convicted of assault with intent to commit murder and sentenced to 3 years imprisonment in the penitentiary. He's held to be a man of means, worth 66 horses. Eagle Shakantaya is noted for improving his English skills in reading, writing, and speaking while in prison. Efforts by tribal peoples to assimilate sometimes met with favor, and perhaps as a result of these efforts, he is released 7 months early, leaving on a stagecoach to Pendleton and then to rejoin his tribe in Nez Perce County. Luther Galvano is a trapper and packer by occupation. He's charged with grand larceny in Ada County as a 25-year-old. His descent is recorded as half indigenous. He's convicted, sentenced to 1 year in the penitentiary, and frequently noted for good behavior by prison officials in the records. The Sheep Eater War of 1879 was fought between the U.S. Army and Shoshone people who were alleged to have killed 5 Asian miners. They were known as sheep eaters as part of their diet consisted of bighorn sheep. Poor weather and difficult terrain in the Salmon River area made this a war of attrition. The U.S. Army, finding a mother and her children, held the infant hostage before bringing in 51 tribal peoples, consisting of many women and children. The baby was said to have cried incessantly during the mother's absence. They were then marched to Fort Vancouver as prisoners of war. This late 1800s photograph features a family group of the Sheep Eater Band of the Shoshone tribe encamped in a teepee along a creek in Idaho Territory. The end of the Bannock War frustrates the U.S. Army, and the allies of the Bannock simply disperse, some to the Salmon Mountains. Nine Pipes is an eminent Nez Perce tribal member who we remember formerly served time in the Territorial Prison for grand larceny. He's rumored to be passing back and forth between the warring indigenous camp and his reservation during the Sheep Eater campaign. Several years later, he travels as a guide with an exploratory expedition of a transportation company to the Bitterroot Mountains. Nine Pipes marries Annie, and his family lives in a log cabin. In July of 1885, Nine Pipes and a fellow tribal member named Alexander are both shot. Alexander is said to be hiding from police when Police Captain Tom Hill is sent to arrest him. Alexander resists arrest, and Nine Pipes and others come to his aid. Nine Pipes dies from the gunshot wound he incurs during this struggle. A grand jury indicts Tom Hill, also of the Nez Perce tribe, for killing Nine Pipes in November of 1885. The sheriff arresting Tom Hill finds him suffering from a blow to the head, sustained in a fight with a tribal member. His trial is granted a change of venue and begins in Lewiston, drawing much interest from the public. Hill is acquitted in June of 1886 on the grounds of a justifiable homicide in the execution of public duty. The other tribal members aiding Alexander in resisting arrest escaped the jail at Lewiston. The agent of the Nez Perce Reservation, Charles Monteith, is heavily criticized by the surrounding community for placing Tom Hill in a position of authority, calling the trial a miscarriage of justice. All is forgiven, though, when the agent agrees to open the Nez Perce Reservation to non-tribal member settlement, after granting tribal members their allotments per the Dawes Act of 1887. Annie, the widow of 9 Pipes, later remarries a Nez Perce man named John Red Wolf. Brothers Kaya and Tippanoot from the Nez Perce tribe were attending a church service when a clerk of the agent, Mr. Crocker, attempts to arrest Tippanoot, who is said to have violated reservation law. Tippanoot, at 6 feet tall and 29 years of age, resists being apprehended. Mr. Crocker then fires 3 shots, and Tippanoot falls wounded. His younger and smaller brother, Kaya, overcome by grief and anger, then rushes at Mr. Crocker, toppling him with a rock. The clerk suffers a broken skull bone, but all parties end up recovering from these injuries. At the trial of Tippanoot and Kaya, an interpreter is present, making a significant impact regarding the outcome in sentencing. The sound of the eloquent Nez Perce language is noted by the newspapers for being novel and interesting to those present at the trial. Tippanoot is convicted of assault and sentenced to 1 year in prison, with Kaya being convicted of assault with intent to commit murder and sentenced to 2 years. They begin serving their terms together in late November of 1880. John McKay comes to the Territorial Prison in 1881 as a 20-year-old. He has 1/4 tribal ancestry. His father was born in Oregon and his mother in Manitoba, a province of Canada. John was born in Oregon and grew up near Pendleton. In 1880, he's living in Chalice and working as a cook for a pack train. He is tried and convicted in October term of court for stealing horses with a man of Euro-American descent named George Bishop. They're sentenced to 2 and 3 year terms for grand larceny. Now, the Idaho Tri-Weekly Statesman newspaper reporter speculates that George is given a heavier sentence for partnering with a tribal member, but prison records show that it was actually John who is issued the stricter sentence. There are other inaccuracies in the same news article, which hold that John is a practicing doctor who had been educated back east, but this is likely a different citizen by the same name, given John's young age and occupation, as listed in the 1880 U.S. Census record. John McKay is later reported as leaving Boise City on a stagecoach, while the John McKay convicted of grand larceny is still incarcerated in the Territorial Prison. Prior to the Major Crimes Act of 1885, intertribal offenses were tried in tribal court. But in 1885, 3 young men from the Fort Hall Reservation were tried by the U.S. government for grand larceny, having stolen horses from a fellow tribal member named Tendoy. Their names are Coit, who is the youngest indigenous man to serve time in the Territorial Prison at only 15 years old, Tabashi, who is 21, and Tashup, the oldest at age 32. They are also the first tribal prisoners issued numbers. The younger 2 are given 1 year terms and discharged 1 month early for adhering to prison rules, while the oldest is given 10 years, likely having taken a leading role in committing the theft. Tashup's time is halved in 1890, and he returns to his wife, Melina, and son, Louis, who would now be 9 years old. Tabashi and Coip receive early discharges for good behavior, as indicated by the prison record on the left. You'll notice the line restoring full rights of citizenship is crossed out, indicating otherness. The U.S. reservation agent from Fort Hall and Tashup himself both write Territorial Governor Shoup requesting clemency for Tashup. This is granted and halves his sentence to 5 years, largely due to his good conduct at the prison. The cursive used in the late 1800s prison records and correspondence can be challenging for present-day historians to decipher. Amon is born in Utah and became a herder by occupation. He's convicted of grand larceny in Bingham County and begins serving his 2-year sentence at the Territorial Prison as a 27-year-old in 1885. A newspaper article in the Idaho Tri-Weekly Statesman specifies that he is an Indian. This is a common misnomer of the time, as Christopher Columbus did not arrive at the islands east of India in 1492, yet one that persists. Prison officials often chose the wording of copper to describe the complexion of a person of indigenous descent, as well as the word black to describe their hair and eye color in prison records. Amon is issued prison number 116 and serves out his full 2-year sentence. Henneby is the first woman incarcerated in the history of the permanent territorial prison, raising new issues and challenges for prison officials. She's from the Shoshone-Bannock tribe and resides on the Fort Hall Reservation when she is convicted for meme-loosing or killing her husband. She arrives at the prison in May of 1887 and is housed in her own cell, but in the same building as the 79 male prisoners, because guess what? It's the only cell house at the time. A private grand jury is convened and determines that this lack of a separate women's facility is injurious both to the health of the prisoners and to proper discipline. As the prison's first female, the guards imagine she will not be much trouble. Henneby is noted for good conduct and hard work during her first 5 months in the prison, and prison officials trust her. One evening, the turnkey guard sends her out for her bucket, which serves as a toilet for prisoners throughout the night. Although she's just 5 feet 3 inches tall, Henneby clambers up over the 12-foot wooden fence surrounding the territorial prison. When she fails to return, the official goes out to make sure she's all right. Much to his surprise, Henneby is nowhere to be found. An all-night search party led by Warden Haley avails nothing. They regard this escape as an abuse of trust and very unladylike. It seems that they underestimated her because she was a woman. Prison officials offer a reward for her capture. She eludes authorities for 10 days and then is discovered back at the Fort Hall Reservation. This is almost 200 miles from the prison, the equivalent of a 6-day walk. A newspaper article later reports that she rode train cars in order to travel back to her family. Tribal police return her to the prison on November 14th, along with a letter for Warden Haley, and secure the reward. Henneby and the letter written by reservation officials on her behalf relate to prison officials that she escaped because she missed her children and longed to visit them. This jailbreak, made in the name of motherly affection, tugs at the public's heartstrings. They clearly sympathize with this mother of 2. Moreover, court officials and the community members familiar with the circumstances connected to the crime recommend that Henneby be pardoned for the killing of her husband, who is described as a thankless Indian in prison records and appears to have been abusive. Territorial Governor Stevenson pardons Henneby in June of 1888. She serves right around 1 year when all is said and done. After her release, Henneby marries a man from her tribe named Perpetua Arasta. In the 1890 census, Henneby Arasta is 30 years old. Sadly, her son dies in 1903. She goes on to marry 2 more times, first a man named Buffalo West, and then a man named Major Tommy. Tuberculosis was highly prevalent on the Fort Hall Reservation at this time, and this infectious disease took the lives of many members of the Shoshone and Bannock tribes. The 1912 U.S. Census at Fort Hall is the last year she is listed. She would have been 52 years old. It's likely that she died shortly after this time. The final account takes us to a ranch just outside of Salmon City in May of 1887. Mrs. Horace Rood is home alone with her 4 boys when an Indigenous man shows up and persistently asks her to buy his pony. She steadfastly refuses. Angered by her refusal and intoxicated, he breaks the window and fires 2 shots through the hole. The first rifle shot hits Mrs. Rood in the chest, right above her heart, and the second sails above the head of her 9-year-old son and lodges in the wall. The man then rides away. Burl and Willard, her sons, set off to the doctors to secure medical assistance for their mother, avoiding the main roads. Women from the town accompany the doctor to assist the Roods. Her injury, though serious, is not fatal. A party of Salmon City men, outraged by the shooting, descend upon a nearby camp of Indigenous people. They apprehend, interrogate, and threaten the entire group with hanging if they fail to disclose the name of the man who shot Mrs. Rood. The group relates that he is a man of their tribe, known in English as Charlie, and that he's left for his family home in Custer. Shortly thereafter, agency police head to arrest Charlie. He's captured on June 18th and held for the next term of court. Townspeople, knowing that Charlie was intoxicated the night of the crime, vowed to crack down on the sale of liquor to tribal peoples. In court, Charlie reveals that he drank a mixture of horse ointment, a pain reliever, and lemon essence, a natural antiseptic. For this reason, the magistrate felt that there were no grounds for the charge of procuring liquor in Charlie's case, although he does exhibit signs of an alcohol dependency. Hard liquor was unknown to tribal peoples until brought in by Europeans, who encouraged their consumption of it, often for the purposes of securing favorable terms in trade and treaties. Recreational drinking began to undermine traditional tribal cultures, as they did not have much time to adapt or develop social and moral guidelines regulating its use. Alcoholism became a serious problem in many tribal communities, and 1832 legislation aimed to prevent the sale of liquor on reservations largely failed. 18 people selling liquor to tribal peoples were imprisoned during the territorial time period. Charlie was born in Idaho, and his tribal name is Quentin Babby. He is convicted of assault with intent to commit murder for shooting Mrs. Rood. Judge Hayes sentences Quentin to 10 years, beginning in October of 1887. He is admitted from Lemhi County. President Grant created the Lemhi Reservation by executive order, and it operated from 1875 until 1907 for a group of Shoshone and Bannock peoples. Chief Tendoy was their main leader. This may have been the same Tendoy that Coit, Tabashi, and Tashup were convicted for stealing horses from. In May of 1893, Quentin applies for a pardon. It's unclear whether this was granted. Burl Rood is senselessly killed in a scuffle over a loaded gun at a halfway house in 1903. Willard Rood and his wife, Beulah, become realtors active in the Chalice community. The Lemhi people are forcibly removed from their ancestral homelands to Fort Hall in 1907. To conclude, I wanted to share some final reflections and express my gratitude to those who have been so supportive of my work during this project. In response to tribal people's efforts to resist colonization, the U.S. Army established Fort Boise in 1863. Settlers set up supporting businesses and farms nearby, resulting in Boise City. The Snake War was the fourth war of this time period, although it has been largely forgotten. It was fought from 1864 until 1868 between soldiers and indigenous people. It was actually characterized by guerrilla warfare and resulted in over 1,700 casualties. This presentation highlighted the Camas Prairie near present-day Fairfield, Idaho, but the people of the Nez Perce tribe also managed a Camas Prairie further north by selectively harvesting camas and conducting controlled burns. In addition to the better-known Trail of Tears, when Eastern tribes were relocated to lands west of the Mississippi after 1830, there were local trails of tears, such as when people of the Lemhi Reservation were forcibly removed from their ancestral lands, and when the Paiute prisoners of war were marched back to the Duck Valley Reservation after the Bannock War. Finally, in contemplating Tamiaga and Nohua's request to die together, the way in which Kaya defended his wounded brother Tipanut, and how 9 Pipes perished, helping Alexander resist arrest, it becomes evident that they were resisting something far greater than individual officials of the given moment. Criminally just proceedings, in a narrow sense, can seem far less so when broader systems of injustice are in place. The history of this region and time period have so much to tell us. Thank you for being here to listen. Many thanks to Nolan Brown, our tribal contact, my family, as this was a crazy busy semester for me, the staff of the Idaho State Archives, and the Old Idaho Penitentiary. You know who you are. Your mentoring assistance has made all the difference. Thank you.